Over the past few months, debates have emerged around the removal of Confederate monuments from across the nation. One of the more recent events surrounding this issue, the rally in Charlottesville that brought together white nationalists and neo-Nazis in protest over the planned removal of a Robert E. Lee statue, puts in stark relief the white supremacist logic at the core of the Confederacy and this drive to preserve a celebratory narrative of it. And yet this marriage of white supremacist logic and this celebration of the Confederacy, however, represent a much larger national investment in a particular narrative of the Old South, one in which the Southern landscape was full of sprawling cotton plantations, benevolent masters, and faithful slaves. From purchasing pancake syrup, like the Aunt Jemima Mammy-like syrup, to visiting and even holding weddings at restored Southern plantations, Americans have and continue to consume a particular fictional myth of the Old South, again, one in which blacks happily served their white superiors. Yet this nostalgia goes much further than the US. And this is where my research comes in. In my dissertation, I explore how other countries were just as equally invested in this myth as well, particularly by looking at the circulation of 20th century American culture productions that contain this nostalgia and circulated outside the US to places like Canada and Australia. Now you might ask, why Canada and Australia? Like the US, Canada and Australia represent white settler societies, which means that they sought to create and sustain a white nation through the removal of indigenous populations. And so one of the cultural productions that traveled to these other white settler societies was Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, many of you may have first encountered Uncle Tom's Cabin in grade school. That's actually, in fact, when I first encountered the text. However, my initial engagement with Uncle Tom's Cabin was not just through the page, but also on the stage. When I was in 8th grade, my middle school put on The King and I, which contains a performance of a scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin. And lo and behold, little bitty me, as a 13-year-old, played the white evil slave owner, Simon Legree, in that very scene. And so from a very young age, I was already encountering two of the many iterations of Uncle Tom's Cabin and could see firsthand this nostalgic understanding of the US South that it was reproducing. Little did I know that Uncle Tom's Cabin would continue to be so much a part of my research later on. And so now, years later, as an American Studies scholar, I'm not only interested in the iterations of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the nostalgia that it contained, but also how it circulated and moved across space, again, particularly to other white settler societies. And so, one of these societies was Australia. From the mid-19th century onward, Uncle Tom's Cabin emerged in a variety of forms in Australia, from material culture like dolls and board games, to the screen, like this 1928 film called Topsy and Eva, based on two of its main characters, and on stage, like this 1931 stage production in Melbourne, which featured white actors who blackened their faces in what we know as blackface, in order to portray black characters as either evil and grotesque, or as docile and unwaveringly faithful. In its many forms, Uncle Tom's Cabin was right at home in this new context, precisely because Australia was already so deeply invested in white supremacy. And we can see this through a series of policies unofficially beginning in the 1850s, known as the White Australia Policy, which through child removal of indigenous populations and also the deportation of Asian immigrants, Australians sought to, again, create and sustain a purely white nation in what was known as the white Australia ideal. So why does the circulation of Uncle Tom's Cabin in Australia even matter? To me, as an American Studies scholar, it matters because it allows me to understand the US in relation to the rest of the world, particularly through these transnational flows of culture. At a moment when American Studies is particularly invested in the transnational, understanding and rethinking the US not as a singular nation, but as part of a larger geographical context becomes most urgent. For you, it matters because our everyday consumption and the very public spaces that we navigate each and every day are deeply saturated in this fictional myth of the Southern past. And so the next time you turn on your television and you see yet again another rally in support of Confederate monuments, remember that this drive to preserve a celebratory narrative of the Confederacy and this larger nostalgia around it is not just an American problem, but a global one. Thank you.